Our next speaker is Dr. Mike Brown, making the presentation on Bridge Washing Pocket Guide. Dr. Brown is a senior supervising engineer in the Herndon, Virginia office of WSP USA.
So thank you very much. I'm active in the Bridge Preservation Expert Task Group that's sponsoring the development of these pocket guides, and I happen to volunteer to help coordinate the development of this bridge cleaning guide. It's something that I've looked at on and off for a number of years, formerly when I was doing research for Virginia, and so felt it was an important thing to provide some uniform guidance. There's been a lot of discussion over the years of what is the value of bridge washing and how do we characterize that. So I thought that this guide would be particularly useful to the industry. So the effort is being coordinated amongst a group of us, sort of nucleated out of the expert task group, but also drawing on some other resources, folks from industry. And this is not an exclusive list. If you have a particular interest and knowledge in this area, we more than welcome your input. But these are the folks that are currently working on developing the guide. So the overall issue, the benefits of bridge cleaning, started out as referring to it as bridge washing, and then we decided, well, maybe that's a little bit of a misnomer because washing isn't the only way that you can go about cleaning these elements, and so we've changed it to a bridge cleaning guide, but including sweeping, rinsing, flushing, etc. Primarily, debris removal from your bridge components because blocked up drainage and debris accumulated in your bridge deck joints are good examples where you have an accelerated form of deterioration, whether you have ponding that's holding chlorides and other issues on and above your components, or the debris actually pushing through and destroying your deck joints. And then we all know how once you've breached a deck joint, how that then rains down contaminants onto the substructure and leads to accelerated deterioration of both superstructure and substructure components as well. So bridge cleaning can be highly valuable in terms of putting off some of those issues. So Greg showed a little bit more comprehensive list that he had extracted from my earlier presentation, but just an overview of kind of the conceptual outline for this pocket guide. Obviously, we want to talk about the purpose and scope of what we're doing, and the scope being primarily limited to direct cleaning of the bridge elements. So as he mentioned, we're not going to talk about, for example, debris accumulation at substructures due to flood events, some of the large-scale debris type issues, because those are a little bit different than what we're considering here in terms of bridge cleaning. But give an overview as to the types of exposure and how those things will impact functionality of the deck, the substructure elements, durability, and even potential safety issues, and then categorize the kinds of things that we're dealing with. Not only do you have surface debris and salts on decks, but anybody who's managed structures understand that you also have accumulation of animal feces, etc., that can be highly corrosive to bridge elements. So a number of reasons that you want to undertake these activities. Again, the intent of the guide is to address the various methods and give some good criteria for how you go about doing that, and maybe even some QC types of things to implement along the way. And then also considering the environmental impacts and regulations. That becomes kind of a pretty significant impediment to executing bridge cleaning, and so we want to provide some good guidance on that. One of the issues is that we can't really write a guide that's going to be tailored to every state and its individual environmental regulatory entities, so we're going to have to try to give some overarching guidance based on what's involved with, of course, federal requirements, but also then what more common practices or issues are amongst the various states to help provide at least some good direction for somebody who's looking at these, and perhaps cite some good references for them. And then, another question that relates back to the environmental issue, but also some more practical things is, what do you do with if you're washing, for example, what do you do with the runoff? Do you contain it? Do you treat it? Or is it okay to let it run off if you're in the right situation, perhaps if there's sufficient volume of water so that you're diluting the effects of contaminants and what have you. So you have to look at those various issues. We'll discuss that a little bit in the guide. We'll talk about the frequency of treatment and what some of the factors are to consider in doing that. We won't spend a lot of time in the guide talking about maintenance of traffic. A lot of the maintenance of traffic is pretty typical for most other bridge activities, but there may be a few things that we want to talk about with regard to these applications. We'd like to talk a little bit about the benefits as we can gather that. There's been some limited studies around the country on this, but it's still not something that's been thoroughly documented. So we'll gather what we can and try to provide the information. So I'm going to spend most of the rest of the presentation talking about a survey that we did, and some of you who are involved in the partnerships may have seen this survey come around because that was our primary means for distributing it, was to try to tap the major state agencies around the country to learn what their practices are around this. It was something that our task group decided to do to help inform our effort. And so we did get a pretty healthy set of responses across the country, both geographically and in terms of overall number of agencies. What was interesting, the primary question was, does your agency have a formal bridge cleaning program? And so here the map kind of shows you, if it's green, they said yes. If it's red, they said no. I didn't think about it earlier, but as I was reviewing this for the presentation, I realized that most of the agencies that focus on bridge cleaning are in the north. So there's a correlation there. I don't know if it correlates to de-icing environments or there's something else involved, but that seems to be the practice. So again, states with cleaning programs. So 20 said yes, 12 said no. We also asked about which types of elements they focus on in their programs. And so we had primarily prompted them for things like decks, bearings, joints, beam ends, and et cetera. And then we left an other category in case somebody thought of something that we didn't consider to be common. And so we'll talk about some of the responses relative to those. So with respect to decks, we had asked about the selection of elements and the timing of cleaning for the various elements. One interesting anecdote is when we talked about selection, at least one agency, I guess we didn't phrase the question very well because their response was low bid. So that wasn't really what we'd intended for the question, but that was a response. But the idea was, how often do you clean if you have a program? And of course, the ones that didn't have programs didn't continue to answer these other questions. But on the left are a number of the types of things that they used in terms of selection of which bridges they would focus on. So border bridges for one state, meaning bridges over a large river that they happen to share with another state. There were large, more complex capital structures, and so those they tended to spend more effort on. Some states said all bridges, but a lot of folks, a lot of agencies wouldn't be able to do that across the board. At least one state divides theirs in half and does it on a biannual basis. So that was the other part of the question, is how frequently. So the most common answer is, yeah, we do this on an annual basis. Some, every 2 years. At least one said they do it twice a year, which I thought was unusual. And then the other thing we had asked about are what are the relative costs for the cleaning? And so we got a range of different answers. We didn't give a specific format that we asked for the response. So the agency that talked about the large border bridges said, 50 to 70K per bridge, which is a pretty significant investment, but if they're very large structures, I suppose I understand that. Others gave a range, 2 to 10K. Some gave it on a square foot basis, ranging from 4 to 24 cents a square foot. So a couple of different values, quite a broad range. I'm not sure we could create a significant guidance specifically from that. But the other thing that we did was collect, information about contacts in these agencies. So our group's going to plan to follow up with some of these folks to get a little bit more background on some of these things. Moving on to bearings, you can see again some of their criteria. Some looked only at bearings where they have open joints above. Some, looking at dividing their inventory into regions and doing it incrementally. And here the frequency was a little bit more broadly distributed. Annually is still pretty common, but you see some other responses. A lot of the folks said that they try to focus these efforts, regardless of the element, on springtime, which of course makes sense if you're following up on winter events. Some specifically said within a period of time of the last storm event. Expansion joints, again, some of the criteria were very similar to that of the bearings, although not as many agencies necessarily focus on one versus the other. Beam ends, so again, at least one agency was saying that those open joints were a focus area for them where they wanted to get to the beam ends because they knew that those areas were going to be exposed. Some try to do as many as they can within their resource constraints. And a lot of them will combine with cleaning of other elements. In this case, for example, bridge seats and caps might be combined with the beam end cleaning, which seems logical. And then other elements. So other elements, that was open, so we got feedback having to do with railings or barriers, and some even doing some of the substructure column areas as part of their cleaning. Not nearly as many respondents doing those things. We also asked the question about how do you staff your cleaning operations, and our intent was, do you do it with in-house forces, state forces, et cetera, or do you contract that work out? The intent was to allow the respondents to indicate either or both, but it turned out to be one of those deals with the survey thing where it was a radio button and it turned into either or. You couldn't pick both. And I know a number of agencies may do it both ways depending on the structure, where it's located, or even what region of their organization and how they tend to do business locally. So unfortunately, we have the divide as the either or, but I suspect the truth is somewhere in between. We also asked them to provide us some input on what provisions they have, if they contract it out or whatever guidance they have for their in-house folks regarding how they go about it. And this lends itself towards some explanation of the methods used. So some use pressure washing, some prefer flushing, if you will, which would be more high flow but low pressure rinsing of elements. Constraints about keeping debris and personnel out of the water, or whether or not they have requirements for containment. And these are going to be important inputs for the guidance that we give. Also, if you've got hard debris, how do you handle that? Does it get flushed away with the rinse aid, or some people actually remove it mechanically first, which is probably a preferable practice. And Virginia, when they responded, actually gave a fairly detailed response having to do with their methods for different components, and even provided input on the pay items they use for their contracts. When asked about environmental issues in coordination with agencies, about half and half of the respondents to this question regarding whether or not they had any formal agreement with the environmental entity. And so we hope to, for those who did have formal agreements in place, to follow up with them and try to get some more details as to what those contain, so that we can then kind of glean some guidance out of that for the guide. We also asked whether or not they try to coordinate these cleaning activities with other specific activities on the structures. And the primary question in my mind was whether or not they coordinate their bridge cleaning with, for example, their biennial safety inspection, because it's a lot easier to inspect something if it's been cleaned and you get a better idea. And there are a handful of agencies that actually do that and coordinate it. Majority do not specifically do so. Another question was whether or not an agency had gone to any specific effort to document the benefits. As I said, there are some studies that have been done I'm aware of over the years. Rhode Island had a report that they put out, and I think a few others. Very few, though, reported having any formal documentation. Some of them reported being in the process of starting to track internally, but their programs weren't far enough evolved to have any significant data to report. So that's an overview of the survey and what we're intending to do with the guide. There's still a considerable bit of work to do to refine the actual document, and as I said, we welcome any input that folks may have. We'll make this inclusive and then make it of the most possible benefit to the industry.
Just a general question. When was the survey coming out? When did the survey take place? I missed it.
The survey was done through a SurveyMonkey instrument that the coordinators for TSP2 helped us with, and it was done very early this calendar year, like January timeframe.
During your survey, did you ask, were one of the questions, were there any type of measurements done for chlorides or salts left on the surface by any of these, I guess, departments you asked? Were there any responses?
That was not a question, although I can see the value of that question.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's possible we could assemble some follow-up. As I said, we've got contact for all of the respondents, so we could, put that amongst a list of follow-up questions to see whether anybody has formally documented that. I'm not aware of anybody that does that, but I would be interested to know if they do.
The preceding was produced by the National Center for Pavement Preservation. More information can be found on the web at pavementpreservation.org. Additional support provided by Michigan State University.